Your commute crosses a bridge that's 47 years old. It was designed to last 50. The average bridge in poor condition is 68 years old. There are 42,400 of them. And every day, Americans make 163 million crossings on these structurally deficient bridges. The US just got its highest infrastructure grade ever, a C. And even with that C, the math says more collapses are inevitable. Welcome to Collapse Report, where infrastructure, liability, and economics collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. Let's set the stage. March 2025, the American Society of Civil Engineers releases its infrastructure report card, the grade C, the first time they've ever given the US infrastructure a C, up from C- in 2021. 8 categories improved: roads, bridges, transit, dams, all moving in the right direction. This isn't speculation, this is the official assessment. And here's the part they buried in the fine print. Even with the highest grade in 27 years, the funding gap is now $3.7 trillion. That's not a typo. $3.7 trillion. And it's worse than it was 4 years ago. So how do you spend more money than ever before and still fall further behind? How does grade C, the best grade in history, come with $1 trillion warning label? The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act injected $550 billion. States are spending more. Private investment is up. And yet the gap grew from 2.59 trillion in 2021 to 3.7 trillion today. But to understand why, we need to follow the money. This problem started in the 1950s and 1960s. The interstate highway system, the great American infrastructure boom. Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act in 1956. Over the next 35 years, America built 47,000 miles of interstate highways and hundreds of thousands of bridges. The plan was simple: build it, maintain it, replace it every 50 years. And for a generation, it worked. According to ASCE's 2025 report card, the average US bridge is 47 years old, compared to the typical 50-year designed lifespan. But here's what happened. Maintenance is boring. Maintenance doesn't win elections. Maintenance doesn't get your name on a plaque. So decade after decade, politicians chose new projects over maintaining old ones. By 1998, when ASCE released its first infrastructure report card, America's infrastructure got a D. Not because we stopped building, because we stopped maintaining. The bridges we built in the 1960s were now 30 years old. The ones from the 1970s were 20 years old. All of them aging, none of them being replaced. And the problem compounded because deferred maintenance doesn't freeze the damage. It accelerates it. A crack you ignore for 5 years doesn't stay a crack. It becomes a structural deficiency. And structural deficiencies cost exponentially more to fix than routine maintenance ever would have. Now fast forward to 2025, we have 623,000 bridges in the United States. Of those, 42,400 are in poor condition. That's 6.8%. Another 306,000 are in fair condition, 49.1%. Only 275,000 are in good condition. Fair sounds acceptable until you understand what it means. Fair means the bridge has general signs of deterioration. Fair means it needs attention. Fair means it's on the clock. And most importantly, fair means it's much cheaper to maintain now than to rebuild later. But here's the trap. When you have 42,400 bridges in poor condition and 306,000 in fair condition, and your budget can only fix a fraction of them each year, what do you prioritize? The ones about to collapse, or the ones that could be preserved at lower cost? And there's one more factor that makes everything worse. The US population in 1960, when most of this infrastructure was designed, was 180 million people. Today, it's 340 million, nearly double. These highways weren't built for this much traffic. These bridges weren't engineered for this many crossings. The water systems weren't designed for this many homes. We're running 21st century demand on 20th century infrastructure. And that's before you factor in climate change, more extreme weather, heavier rainfall, flooding that wasn't in the original engineering calculations. Each storm, each freeze-thaw cycle, each heat wave, all of it accelerates the decay. Sound familiar? It should. This pattern isn't unique to the United States. Rome let its aqueducts crumble. Britain watched its Victorian railways decay. Every empire that stopped investing in infrastructure eventually paid the price. The pattern is always the same. Build, neglect, crisis, scramble. But here's where it gets personal. Who pays when infrastructure fails? Not the politicians who deferred the maintenance. Not the contractors who built it 60 years ago. You do. When the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapsed in Baltimore, 6 construction workers died. The bridge had passed its most recent inspection. It was rated fair, but when a container ship struck it, the entire structure came down in seconds. The economic impact, $15 million per day in lost commerce. The total cost, over $2 billion in rebuilding and economic disruption. Those workers crossed that bridge because someone approved the project. Those companies lost revenue because someone said the infrastructure was adequate. The pattern always ends the same way. The people using the infrastructure pay the price, while those who neglected it move on. And when one bridge fails, it doesn't just affect that bridge. The traffic has to reroute. That puts more load on other aging bridges. Those bridges wear out faster. The costs compound. The timeline accelerates. Look at what happened after the I-35W bridge collapsed in Minneapolis in 2007. 13 people died. 145 injured. The investigation found it was a design flaw. Gusset plates that were too thin. But here's the economic part. That wasn't the only bridge with that design flaw. Suddenly, every similar bridge in America needed inspection, emergency repairs, weight restrictions. Some were closed entirely. The economic cost went far beyond the $234 million to rebuild that one bridge. It cascaded through the entire system. Which brings us back to that C grade. Sounds pretty good, right? Best grade ever. Progress. Improvement. But let's look at what C actually means according to ASCE's grading scale. A grade of C is mediocre and requires attention. It indicates infrastructure is in fair to good condition, but shows general signs of deterioration and requires attention. Some elements exhibit significant deficiencies. Mediocre. Requires attention. Significant deficiencies. This is the best grade we've ever gotten. And 9 categories, half the report card, are still in the D range. That means poor, at risk, with many elements approaching the end of their service life, and strong risk of failure. Your best grade in 27 years is still mediocre, with significant deficiencies and half the categories at risk of failure. That's not progress you celebrate. That's a warning you're still not taking seriously enough. So let's do the math. ASCE says we need $9.1 trillion from 2024 to 2033 to bring all infrastructure to a state of good repair. That's good repair, not perfect, just functional, safe, adequate for current demand. Current funding projections, federal, state, local, and private combined, total $5.4 trillion. And that leaves a $3.7 trillion gap, $3.7 trillion. To put that in perspective, that's more than the entire federal budget for a year. That's 17% of US GDP. That's the entire economy of Germany. And if we don't close that gap, ASCE's economic study projects the US will lose $10 trillion in GDP by 2039. 344,000 jobs lost. $1.9 trillion in lost disposable income for American families. The trick is simple. Announce big spending numbers. Get the headlines. Take credit for infrastructure investment, but never spend enough to actually solve the problem. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA, was celebrated as a once-in-a-generation investment. $1.2 trillion total. $550 billion in new infrastructure spending. And it was significant. It's why the grades improved. But here's what they didn't tell you. That $550 billion over 5 years averages $110 billion per year, spread across 18 infrastructure categories for the entire country. When the gap is $3.7 trillion, that doesn't even come close. And the IIJA funding authorization expires in 2026, next year. After that, it's back to the old funding levels unless Congress acts again. Which means the slight improvement we've seen It could reverse. For wealthy Americans and corporations with private infrastructure, their own roads, their own water systems, their own power backup, infrastructure decay is an inconvenience. For everyone else, it's a safety risk you can't avoid. You cross those bridges, you drink that water, you depend on that electrical grid. They don't. Here's the economics that makes this inevitable. Every dollar spent on resilient infrastructure saves $13 in post-disaster costs. That's not theory. That's from ASCE's analysis of actual disasters. But that $13 savings happens in the future, maybe years from now, maybe decades. The $1 cost happens today, and politicians don't get re-elected based on disasters that didn't happen. They get re-elected based on visible projects they can cut ribbons at, so the incentive structure is backwards. Spend on new, defer maintenance, kick the can down the road. Let the next administration deal with it. Except the next administration doesn't deal with it either. They kick it further, until the bridge collapses, until the dam fails, until people die. And then everyone acts shocked and promises it'll never happen again, until it does. And there's a hidden cost multiplier nobody talks about. When infrastructure fails, it doesn't just cost what it costs to fix it. It costs everything connected to it. A bridge closes. Now trucks reroute 40 miles. That's extra fuel, extra time, extra wear on other roads. Companies miss deliveries. Factories slow down. Workers get fired because the supply chain broke. A water main bursts. Now a hospital has to evacuate. Surgeries are cancelled. A tech company's data center goes offline. Millions in revenue lost. The Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse cost $2 billion to rebuild. But the Port of Baltimore processes 850,000 vehicles per year, $80 billion in cargo value. Every day it was partially closed, cost the regional economy $15 million. Those costs don't show up in the infrastructure budget, but they're real, and your economy is paying them right now. What makes this dangerous today is that we're not just maintaining old infrastructure anymore. We're managing its collapse in slow motion, while the demands keep increasing. In 2024, 27 extreme weather events hit the United States. The economic damage, $182 billion. Every hurricane, every flood, every wildfire, each one damages infrastructure that was already barely adequate. And climate models say these events are getting more frequent and more severe. Your insurance rates are rising because insurers know what's coming. Your commute is getting longer because traffic is being rerouted around failing infrastructure. Your property taxes are increasing because local governments are scrambling to patch the holes. And if you think this is just about bridges and roads, look at your water bill. 6 billion gallons of treated water are lost every day in the United States through leaking pipes, enough to fill 9,000 swimming pools daily. You're paying to treat water that never reaches you. And the drinking water infrastructure needs $625 billion through 2033. For the wealthy, this means higher property taxes on their second homes. For everyone else, this means contaminated water, boil advisories, and lead poisoning. Ask Flint, Michigan how that worked out. Want to see the crisis in real time? Look at Iowa. 1 in 5 bridges in Iowa is in poor condition. That's the highest rate in the nation. Not because Iowa doesn't try, because Iowa has more bridges per capita than almost any state and no tax base to maintain them. Small towns with 2,000 people are responsible for bridges that cost $5 million to replace. They don't have $5 million, so they post weight limits. School buses have to detour 20 miles, ambulances can't cross, and slowly the town dies because nobody wants to live somewhere. The infrastructure doesn't work. This isn't theoretical. The Davenport apartment building collapsed in May 2023. 3 dead, 1 injured. The investigation found decades of deferred maintenance. The building was 112 years old, and nobody wanted to pay for the repairs until it was too late. Same economics, same incentives, same outcome. And while you're stuck in traffic on a crumbling interstate, there's a parallel infrastructure system you don't see. Private roads, private airports, private water treatment, private power generation. Wealthy neighborhoods are building their own infrastructure because the public system is failing and they don't want to wait for government to fix it. Gated communities with private roads that don't have potholes. backup generators when the grid fails, water filtration systems when the municipal supply is contaminated. According to ASCE's Bridging the Gap study, if funding levels return to pre-IIJA levels after 2026, the US will lose $5 trillion in gross economic output over 20 years and 344,000 jobs. This is infrastructure inequality. When public systems fail, those who can afford to opt out will. Everyone else is stuck depending on infrastructure that's rated C at best, D on average, and actively deteriorating. So what should you take from this? First, understand that infrastructure failure is a financial decision, not an engineering mystery. We know how to build bridges that last. We know how to maintain water systems. We know how to prevent collapses. The issue is never technical. It's economic. Someone decided the maintenance wasn't worth the cost. And you're living with that decision every time you cross an aging bridge. Second, recognize that Grade C with a $3.7 trillion gap is not stability. It's managed decline. The improvement from C- to C means we slowed down how fast things are getting worse. We didn't reverse it, we didn't fix it. We just deferred some of the damage. And unless funding is sustained past 2026 when the IIJA expires, even that modest improvement disappears. Third, protect yourself financially. Infrastructure failure affects property values, insurance rates, and local taxes. If you're buying a home, check the infrastructure. How old is the water system? What condition are the local bridges? What's the flood risk? Because when that infrastructure fails, your property value tanks and your insurance either skyrockets or becomes unavailable. The wealthiest Americans are already factoring this into their decisions. You should too. Infrastructure is the invisible foundation of modern life. When it works, you don't notice it. You turn on the tap, water comes out, you cross the bridge, you get to work, you flip the switch, the lights turn on. But infrastructure doesn't fail all at once. It fails incrementally. A crack becomes a structural deficiency. A deficiency becomes a closure. A closure becomes a collapse. And by the time people pay attention, the cost to fix it has multiplied tenfold. The same tricks that kept Roman aqueducts standing for centuries could keep American bridges functional for decades. The engineering isn't complicated, but the economics are brutal. Spend now or pay exponentially more later. And every government in every era chooses later. Because later is someone else's problem until it isn't. And if you think $3.7 trillion in deferred infrastructure is alarming, wait until you see the next video. Because we're covering the nuclear verdicts crisis. The $51 million median judgment that's bankrupting companies and doubling your insurance premiums. Same economic pattern, different catastrophe. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand it, it will crush you all the same. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. Collapse Report has the answers. I'll show you where to look.